Hello, my name is Caroline Spinks, and I run Norwich Swift Network, and I've been asked to do a webinar for Norfolk Wildlife Trust Wilder Communities Programme. So without further ado, let's crack on. So that we understand that we're all talking about swifts and not getting confused with swallows or house martins. Let's just do a spot the difference of these birds that we see in the skies in the summer. So if you're lucky enough to see and have swifts around you in the summer, you will know exactly that this one here is a common swift. So that's the bird in the middle of this picture, of this slide, and the one on the left is with the red throat is a swallow. And you can see that that's perched up on a wire. You'll never see a swift perched on a wire like this. And then the one on the right is a house martin. And you can see that it's got a white belly, like the swallow's got a white belly, but also a white rump and a white chin. They're a little bit smaller than the common swift. And our swift, it might look black when we see them flying around in the sky, but actually they're quite a dark brown, sort of dark chocolate brown color, and have a little pale chin which fades with age and start off quite white looking when they're young. So other differences apart from being perched up, the swallow has these long tail streamers, which a swift has a forked tail, but not anything like these long tail streamers of the swallow. And another difference is that for the house martins, they also will touch the ground and they collect mud for building the nest. So we've got half a dozen here collecting mud for their nest building. You won't see swifts doing this. They don't use mud for nest building. We occasionally get other types of swifts over on our shores. These ones don't tend to breed here just yet, but they might change as climate changes. The one on the left, which looks like a house martin sort of that's been to the gym, is worked out, is a bit more chunky, is an alpine swift. And the one on the right, which looks much more like our common swift, is a pallid swift. But in fact, they're a little bit paler brown. They're more like milk chocolate brown rather than dark chocolate. And both of these birds will sometimes be seen roosting on buildings rather than sleeping in the air like the common swift does. Globally, there are around 100 species of swift. It's a bit of a debate about a few species, whether they're swifts or not. But the ones we have a family of swifts that are most of about 20 other species which are closely related to the common swift. If you get lucky enough at this time of year, sometimes you might see pallid or alpine swifts in the autumn or the spring as they maybe overshoot migration, or young birds maybe just when they're heading off. They generally, these birds tend to breed a little bit further south. The nests are also quite different between swifts and swallows and house martins. And I actually should say that swifts are more closely related to hummingbirds than they are swallows and house martins. So yeah, that's quite an interesting fact. So they're different sort of families altogether, but the nests are quite different. So both the swallows and the house martins use mud to make their nests, and the swallows use build a nest cup that's open at the top, so they all pile in on the top here, and it's usually on a beam or a shelf, or in an open structure like a shed or a barn, so technically barn swallows. And the house martins are on the outside of a building, sort of tucked up under the eaves usually. They have a little bit of an issue trying to get mud sticking to modern soffit boards, and which are made of plastic. So if you can support house martins too, that's a great thing to be able to do. If you can help put up some artificial cups, especially if you've already got house martins in your area, and there's plastic soffits in a lot of the buildings, then they'll be appreciative of that. So their cup is closed right up to the top, and you can see that there's a little hole where the babies poke their heads out, and the entrance in and out. And they'll generally, have to repair nests around throughout the season, and they'll have multiple broods. Swifts will only have one brood. They're only here for 3 months, so they don't have time for anything else. They only can do one. But the house martins and the swallows will have more. So if it's a really hot summer, I suggest that if you can support any repair work by making a little bit of a muddy patch, if they get some drying out and the nest site starts to collapse, they'd like that as well. Here's a swift nest. It's quite small. Would be about the size of sit in your hand, the palm of your hand, quite comfortably. Now these eggs look huge, but they're actually only about the size of a Cadbury's mini egg. It's quite tiny, and they typically lay 2 to 3 eggs, depending on how fit they're feeling. Now you can see that the nest doesn't really look very much. There's no mud here at all. What they do is they catch anything that's floating about in the air. So these feathers they've obviously caught in the air, and bits of grass or hay, and then they bring it back and stick it together with saliva. So they sort of spit and glue it down, so that it just really stops the eggs rolling about too much. It's really not it's a very basic nest, and it could be easily missed if you're like tidying up a roof space. So that's the other thing about swifts. They nest in a much more sort of in a hidey hole, if you like, whereas the swallows and house martins are much more open. So they're generally looking for holes in buildings, and so they go under the roof tiles mostly, and make their nest usually between the roof felt and the tile. But if there is no felt there on sort of older buildings, then they will be laying sort of making their nest in the sort of roof space itself. So they go over the top of the gutter and over the top of the fascia board, and hopefully be able to enter the house that way. They don't cause any damage. You would barely know that they're there, to be perfectly honest. And yeah, you can see this one here has got a little ring on its right leg, and that's quite unusual because swifts are quite hard to monitor, being aerial all the time. They quite hard to catch and ring. So yeah, we've got a few records of recoveries of ringed birds, and birds that have been ringed in the UK can soon be found 2 days later in places like Holland, Norway, Belgium. Yeah, that's no distance for a swift to be flying in a short space of time. So where do they go? So ringing data is okay, but quite often the bird is dead when you get the record. But we've got technology now where we can tag swifts. Little small satellite tracking tags have been attached to only a handful of birds, and we've got information now on their migration routes and where they go for winter and where their foraging areas are. So this bird they basically birds from the UK would probably go mostly down through France, Spain, down the west coast of Africa, and spend some time over the Congo basin here, like the same areas where our cuckoos go to, and some might go a bit further south. So this tracking here is gone as far south as right down to South Africa and sort of Zimbabwe area. And then they've also tracked common swifts from Beijing, and they come all the way through Asia, down across the Arabian Peninsula, and again, meeting up with our common swifts again in southern Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And it's important to be able to see where they might just rest a little bit. Even though they're airborne constantly, they will perhaps stay in feeding areas after they've done quite a lot of work getting on their journeys south, and then they spend the rest of the winter. So they're here for essentially 3 months. The rest of the time they're down in southern Africa. So I'm just going to share some fun facts why we should care about swifts, because they are amazing birds. And so, yeah, beautifully designed for the aerial lifestyle that they lead. And their top speed in level flight is 69 miles an hour. They've been measured at 69 miles an hour. So they're not breaking the motorway speed limit at all, which is good. But yeah, so we're going to have if you don't have an argument about peregrines being the fastest bird, yeah, but they're not flying in level flight when they're doing their 150 miles an hour stoops. They're just falling out of the sky. In level flight, swifts are the fastest, and they're incredibly agile as well. And that, when they're doing their fast turns around the edges of buildings, and when you see them in the summer in the evenings having their screaming parties, as we call them, they're very social when they're here breeding. The rest of the time they're not so much. But when they're here, you can see them pulling these turns, and you can hear them literally when if you're lucky enough to hear them close to you, you can hear them ripping through the air. And when they're turning corners, they're pulling G-forces, which are much larger than almost twice the G-forces that a fighter jet pilot would be experiencing, which I find absolutely remarkable when you think about this small bird that weighs about 40 grams. How does even tolerate that? It's just unbelievable. This was one I like to share with young people because they love dinosaurs, and we've found fossils. This fossil comes from Germany, and you can clearly see it's a fossilized swift-looking bird, and it's one of our swift ancestors, 49 million years old, around with the dinosaurs. So they've been around on our planet longer than we have, and so I feel like we owe them to be looking after them. We don't want to be losing them. The kids love it because they just think, when you tell them that they're living with dinosaurs, they just go, yeah, this is brilliant. And they start screaming like T-Rex and swifts. Another fun fact is the fact that they're always airborne. We know from the ringing data that there can be quite long-lived birds. We've got ringing data which the record is almost 18 years old. So for a small bird, that's actually quite long-lived. Their average lifespan is probably about 7 to 8 years. You get quite a lot of that. But what the most precarious time, as for most wildlife really, is getting through that first year, particularly birds, getting through the first year and then getting to be able to breed. And swifts generally start breeding when they're 2 to 3 years old. So if their average age is around about 7 or 8 years old, and they're doing all this distance in migration, and they don't actually stop, they even sleep in the air. This picture is of one preening in the air, so that's why it looks like it's lost its head. It's turned its head round and is preening its back. And yeah, so they sleep in the air, and the way that they do that is that they fly up really high, and then they'll just cruise and switch one half of the brain off and take these like micro naps, and then they switch to the other side, micro naps. So yeah, just incredible. I mean, people have said that they've seen them up to a mile high or maybe even higher. But yeah, so they're always constantly airborne. They mate in the air, so they could do easily 3 million miles in a lifetime. I think it's probably, likely to be more than that. I think that's probably an underestimate. I've seen them mating in the air as well, where they join together, so they're up quite high to start with, and then when they lock in together, they start tumbling down, and literally they're doing their mating, and then sort of about 200 meters from the ground they separate. I was getting a bit worried because I was thinking, come on, you got to get apart now, because otherwise you'll never get out. You crash and burn basically. But yeah, so sleeping, mating, eating, getting their nest material, drinking. I mean, drinking, they'll just skim surface of water bodies, or if they're not over water bodies, I guess and they could be in the rain. They'll do a little bit of bathing, keeping those feathers in good condition, in light showers. And yeah, so amazing that they don't actually stop. Once a young swift has fledged, it doesn't touch the ground for 2 to 3 years until it starts to find its own nest, own partner and nest. I find that just amazing. So another thing that they can do, which helps them be perfectly adapted for this kind of lifestyle, is if they need a lot of insects to feed their young, and sometimes if the weather is a bit bad, they'll have to fly quite a long distance to go and find food. So if the parents have been away from the nest for a long time, the young birds can slow down their metabolism and go into torpor, which is like basically just sort of like a deep sleep, and slow everything down. And hopefully they can do this for maybe 2 up to 3 days perhaps, and hopefully by that time the adult birds will be back with some food. So you can see some scruffy looking, there's a bit of fluff, but there's essentially some birds feathers in pin just here with sort of waxy bits coming through. So it's getting, there's one beak there. I think there's 2 birds in this nest, but you can only really see one clearly. And this is the adult at the front. So as you can see, the nest is barely anything. It's, we've given them a nest former here to make sure that it just encourages them to keep the eggs all in one place and they don't go rolling around a box. And these is just bits of poo, and gradually that just breaks down. They're not dirty birds at all. Sometimes the adults will eat it. So yeah, I talked about the feeding in the air, catching all these little insects. So this bird has got a mouthful, it's been on a feeding flight, sort of gathering up food to bring back to the youngsters. And they're probably quite good pest controllers, because they eat all sorts of little tiny flying insects, probably ones that bite us, so like sort of like gnats and mosquitoes, maybe biting flies, that kind of thing. So probably good to have around to reduce those, but also other things that they would eat would be small beetles. And in fact, what is in that bird's throat is a ball of food that looks like this, it's all squished together, and when they get back to the nest site, they'll break it apart for the chicks. And especially when they're smaller, because that's too big for them to cope with. But yeah, when they get older, they'll almost eat the adult's head whilst they're trying to get this down as well. They look, it's like a bun fight when the adult comes back when they're big. But you can see sort of like the exoskeletons of little beetles. So and there'll be maybe spiders in amongst here as well. There's some flies here. And maybe this looks a bit like a micro moth. So anything that's really small enough to deal with. So hoverflies, possibly the smaller hoverflies, that sort of thing. And in this ball of food, there's probably about 1,000 insects. So how do they actually find, you kind of think, how do they find all of this in the sky when it's huge, the sky? So swifts have an amazing sense of smell. And so a lot of these insects are pollinators. So if swifts getting a trail of a heavy scent of pollen around, say, like a field of oilseed rape, they can assume that there's going to be pollinators there. And sure enough, you can find swifts and also like other birds feeding on pollinators over big fields of crop that are in flower, but also around trees that are being pollinated. You can see that we put some boxes up on a school in Norwich, which had a tree in the playground, a big tree. And then the day that I was there, the swifts were feeding round, and they were circling round and round the tree, feeding on the bugs that were attracted to the tree pollen. And that was quite impressive how quickly they locked onto that particular tree at that time. It was lucky for me to be able to see that, and for the kids to see it. So other than their sense of smell, their adaptations are really all based on their aerodynamic and aerial lifestyle. So the wings, we've used the design of swift wings with their long blades, which generate lift very efficiently. Perhaps that's why they can live for so long, because actually they're so well designed that they don't have to put a lot of effort into flying. They're not big flappy birds, are they? Like a pigeon, or for example, they just use their design to generate the lift. And they've got the forked tail adds. These are made of really quite stiff tail feathers, unlike the swallow's sort of streamer style feather. These are quite stiff and give the bird stability when they're turning at high speed. And you can see this sort of design used in the keels of fast sailing boats. So we take a lot of our design and our engineering from inspired by nature, and swifts have been no exception to that, and they've been kind of key on sort of a lot of aeronautical type design. They also have these, so when they're flying, when we talked about food and flying through clouds of small insects, you don't want to be getting that in your eye. So they've also got these tiny, which look like bristles, but actually these are tiny feathers, which are quite stiff. And they're at sort of like at the front and slightly above the eye. So the ones at the above the eye probably stop a bit of glare from the sun. And the ones at the front stop a little bit of the birds, the insects and debris in the air, floating in the air, dust getting into the eye itself. Because they've obviously got to look at keen eyesight to be able to find these tiny insects in the sky and lock on. But then they've got quite a big mouth. So it looks like they've got a tiny mouth because the beak is really small. You can see here, these are the nostrils for that lovely sense of smell. And then when they open it, you can see it opens way back, sort of almost to just where they are under the eye. So they've got a big gape. You can imagine them a bit like a basking shark, I guess, but obviously not that big. And that helps them to, when they're traveling really fast, to lock on and catch these small insects. Interestingly, they have got little legs because they don't use them a lot, but they do need them occasionally, and that's mainly at the nest site. And they've got very sharp claws. If you've ever handled a swift, like I have with it, when I've had ones in care, you realize how sharp their little claws are. And it's for climbing in and out of nest sites and sometimes hanging on to vertical surfaces. So when they're on migration over the Alps, they might sometimes encounter bad weather, and they'll hang on to a building, so like a chalet, maybe underneath, out of the weather, until that moves through. And if they can't fly round it, basically, if they can't fly through it and round it. And the whole lot of them will hang on to each other, and they'll pile up, and they look like a swarm of bees hanging on the side of a building. But they can't do that for very long. So yeah, that's only sort of like a temporary thing, just to get some shelter. But they're lit, and I guess when they're mating in midair, they'll be hanging on to each other, but also fighting over nest sites. They're very precious about their nest sites, because it's really important, because that is the place where the partners reunite. They separate for the rest of the year, so they meet back at the nest site. So that's why it's so important to look after nest sites, not only just to have the babies, but also to meet the partner. So this is the not so fun fact. This shows you the trend in the population over the last 30 years of the swifts in England. So back in 1994, this is from 1994, it's first point. If you say that this is the baseline, every year since, more or less, so this is one that's where it's been up, outlier. But when we counted swifts, when bird surveyors have been counting swift nest sites, it's just been slow, well, actually rapidly dropping off. And so alarm bells have started ringing around here. And so a lot of swift groups nationally are set up to try and help swift populations. And we're now down to, we lost 2/3 essentially in the last 30 years, which is shocking. Why are we losing so many swifts? Basically, it's loss of nest sites. So this bird is just coming out from under this tile here in my street, and I know that this house has been used for 20-30 years for swifts, and they're really, really reliable, this pair. But when people have their roofs repaired, so this house is like over 100 years old, and so when the houses have gradually had their roofs repaired, most people generally have been putting, especially the last 30 years, they've been blocking out wildlife from their roof space. So they could not only be blocking out swifts, but they could also be blocking out starlings and house sparrows, which are also roof nesters. And all three of these species are now on the red list. And most of this is driven by the loss of nest sites. You could also be excluding bats that might occasionally roost in these places as well. So if we compare England, and particularly say Norfolk, the east of England, with say like Holland, with similar sort of farming practices and on the similar latitude. So we could compare maybe insect availability with, is any of this decline driven by the lack of food? Well, in Holland, the nest sites are protected all year round. In the UK, they're only protected when they're active. So that's between May and August. And in Holland, they've only had 1 or 2% decline in their swift population. So I think that tells you everything that you need to know, is that the nest site is key. It's the only bit of habitat that swifts require. The rest is sky and maybe the availability of insects. They can fly so far and fast that they can forage quite well for insects, but finding nest sites is their biggest challenge. So yeah, that's what we all the swift groups across the country are trying to do, is to improve, not just it'll have a knock-on effect for starlings and house sparrows, hopefully, as well. So before they had buildings, they would nest in like crevices in cliffs, say, and these are Hunstanton cliffs, and they still, a few pairs nest there. But they could also nest in the cavities of really big old trees, and I believe that there's some in Abernethy Forest in Scotland that might still use trees to nest in. I keep meaning to get up to Hunstanton and to try and have a look at these birds up there, but I'm usually too busy in the breeding season. So, looking after the swifts around Norwich. So, yeah. So how can you help? Yeah, it's just to report your sightings is one thing as well, because understanding where swifts colonies are, where strong colonies are, particularly, that we could support by putting up nest boxes. And I say nest boxes because swifts like to nest, like I said, they're quite social when they're here breeding, that they having like street projects really works for them. And so if you've got room on your house to put up a box, maybe you could squeeze in a second one, that sort of thing. But the best thing is just to, if you need to have your roof repaired or your gutters redone, is to make sure that they still have access to the nest site. And that's relatively easy to do without compromising your repair work. And it's not going to let in water. It hasn't been for hundreds of years, so why will it now? Yeah, so it's just about, and they, like I said, they don't do any damage when they're in there. You've seen the nest, it's barely anything. So that's where we start from, basically. So 5 years ago, I started, it was just after the pandemic, and I was, you start watching things in your street a bit more that back then, didn't you? And it's kind of like, oh gosh, some of these swift nests are getting blocked off. And so I thought, well, I need to do something about this. So this is the records on Swift Mapper, which is run by the RSPB. And anybody can log on there, just send an email and to prove you're human, basically, and then you can start using Swift Mapper to record your sightings and nest sites, and also where you put your boxes. So this is 5 years ago. This is the records for Norwich, and now after last summer we're up to here, and we're getting much more coverage. You can see we can try to support the existing colonies. The yellow dots which indicate what I call natural nest sites, which we've focused putting boxes up around these areas to try and support them, the colonies there, and expand out from them. So we've got, and you can see from the map that it's following basically all the old Victorian terrace streets of Norwich a lot of the time. So this is what we're looking for. This is a swift nest here on this brick, and it just looks like a bit of nothing really, doesn't it? Just a bit of grass, debris, and a roofer might just think, oh, that's just nothing. So advising your roofers to come and when you're doing repairs, you know, about the presence of swifts is really important. And you could actually put that back if you're going to let them still have access. And the main way that you allow them access still is to not put in these black spiky plastic things which run along the top of the fascia board basically and stop anything to be able to get between the felt and the tile. And you don't, you know, if you just did the few tiles that the Swifts use, it would be absolutely fine, and you could leave the rest in if you wanted to. But I would just say I don't really see the need for it. But it's up to you. But if the easiest thing to help Swifts, if you've got them already, is to leave out the bird guards, remove them if you're there already. And a lot of they just seem to put them in automatically. And I think if you choose not to have them, then make sure you get that message across. The other thing to do that, and a lot of the Swift groups are doing it, and national petitions to Parliament. I mean, they did get debated in Parliament before Christmas last year, and it's the campaign for all new buildings, all new development, to have integral nesting spaces for birds like swifts and house sparrows particularly can both use these swift bricks. And you have to get the right design of brick for the type of construction, the wall. But basically they sit, they have this small, you can see it's very small hole to get into, and then it just sits in the cavity wall. And you can be sure to make sure that it doesn't touch make a bridge across to the inside wall to make a cold spot on the inside. But generally, the brickies should know what they're doing with that. There is a British standard now for Swift bricks, but if you're on a new development, I'd encourage talking to the housing developers and talk about Swift bricks. Just keep talking to them, and eventually they'll get the message. I mean, there's some big developments in Norfolk and Aylsham in Norfolk, and in Brundall in Norfolk going ahead with, and that we've got people talking to them about where to put the Swift bricks. You don't want to put one brick in one house. You want to put them in clusters on and then move to another house maybe a little distance away and put them in clusters, not one on one and one on one. It just doesn't make sense like that. If you have sort of like, say, half a dozen and one gable end, then you can put another half a dozen on the next street, if you like, and that works really well. But we're getting the message through to some of the developers in Norfolk now, and they've been plotted out as part of the development. It's kind of like, not only are we plotting things like care homes and where ponds might go, but we're also plotting where Swift bricks go. But not enough are going in, and the birds absolutely love these. They take to them really well. Well, you have to make sure that they're in the right place. They need good access. You can't have the next house too close to it. Obviously, they won't be able to fly into it. So they come in, like I said, they come in all designs. You can actually make a feature of it if you want. I did say that they don't make a mess, and I suspect that there's possibly a blue tit or a sparrow in here, because we've got a little bit of poop down the wall, whereas where you see the swifts in and out, you can't see any of that. They generally don't do that sort of whitewashing. So don't think that you're going to get the mess that you get with, say, like swallows and house martins. For house martins, just put a board up to catch it, or stick a rose bush underneath it, and that'll do very well. But you can see the claws, the use of the claws here hanging onto the wall before it climbs into the nest site. And here's the little baby's face, he's poking out, getting ready to fledge. Bricks are brilliant. And they work very quickly as well. If you've got like big overhanging area eaves, then you can make a little hole in the soffit board and have a sort of a compartment in the eaves, if you like, on the top of the board. If you put in a nest former as well to stop the eggs rolling about and then rolling down the hole, that would be a good idea. You could either just leave it like that, or you could make it into a box completely to stop them climbing into the roof space itself. But you could get quite a lot along a soffit board, along an eave. And you just cut the hole close to the wall so that they can climb in. But be aware of windows. I just want to highlight that this hole has been cut above a window. If this window is open, then the birds are likely to have an accident trying to get in and out, or not get in and out at all. So that's not good, that having it there. And usually this is on the second story. You can't really do this on the first story of the building. So yeah, Swift boxes generally need to be pretty high, above 3.5 meters, 4 meters, unless they've got a really long runway, like we called it, because if you've got front opening boxes like these ones up here, or the bricks of front opening, then they can sort of fly more or less straight in. They just drop a little bit to slow down. But ones like these ones here, which have got more or less an underside opening, they have to drop down quite a long way. And when they come out, they'll drop down quite a long way before they generate enough lift to get going again. So they need to be 4 meters minimum clearance below them to try and avoid accidents. So this person here has got bricks and boxes of various designs, and obviously a real fan. I'm hoping that they're all full. But you can put them, so if you've got a bungalow, you could try and put something like this design, and there's 6 boxes here in one sort of thing. That's quite hard to put up because it's quite heavy, but if you can get it right up high on the gable end and it's not too close to a neighbor or any trees or whatever, that could prevent easy access for the birds, then you can do that with with a bungalow sort of situation. That's you really, if you're really not sure, then I'd take photos and send them to us and we can give you some guidance. And as to which, we normally say about which aspect, whether they face east, north, whatever, if you've got these boxes hit like this with the white plastic roof on, they're quite good at reflecting a lot of the heat. But if it's a really, really baking south wall, I try and avoid it if you can. And if you've got a bit of eave, you could shove it right up and give it a bit of shade that way as well. But generally, any other aspect will do. It doesn't matter too much. It's all about the access in and out. We don't want any collisions. We don't want anything low. So like if it's close to a road, for example, and they're coming out low and then they fly straight out into streaming traffic, that's no good. Don't do that. That's high risk. I sometimes wonder that they manage to not get hit on any other streets, to be perfectly honest, but on busy roads, go out the back. So high as possible, and good access, and ideally not too close to windows that will open. And get your neighbors involved. So like if you can't do this massive collection, so like 4 or 5 boxes on a house, then talk to your neighbors, see if you can have one each. That works just as well. Street projects, we love doing them. and you can get the kids involved to paint the boxes. They love it. It's brilliant. Or the other thing you can do is talk to your local church warden and see about doing boxes behind the louver windows of church towers. That works pretty well as well, and it's very efficient and cost effective. So you can get these sort of modular cabinets we can build, and they're bespoke, so they're made to fit and fit tight behind the louver windows so that the birds don't get stuck in the tower itself and can't find their way out. But you definitely have to play the calls for this because the birds can't see the holes so easily. You play the calls actually for any new boxes that you want to get the birds to find them quickly. It's almost imperative, I would say. It's not a thing that you would normally do it would normally be classed as disturbance of breeding birds, and that's against the law. So but in this case for swift conservation, and also it works for house martins, you can play the calls to try and encourage them into the boxes, and once they're there, you don't need to play the calls anymore, and the colony will just build naturally. So the church at Bury St Edmunds has been very successful at this. They put in 20 boxes to start with. They got filled within 3 years, and then the next year they put in another 40 boxes, and they got filled very rapidly. And I think they're now putting in, I think they've now got 120 boxes in the tower at Bury St Edmunds at St John's. So it works really well. And like I said, it's quite cheap to do because you get more boxes for your money. So we've done them in some smaller churches' windows. So that first picture was Aylsham Church. This church we did last year is St Albans Church in Norwich, and that worked really well. And you get different designs just to fit. And these are the call player. And you put it on a timer, and you start it at the beginning of May, playing a bare minimum between sort of say 6 and 8 in the morning and 6 and 8 in the evening, or before dusk for a couple of hours when the birds are very active around the nest sites. And yeah, turn it on in the beginning of May if you put it on a timer, and then switch it off at the beginning of August, because essentially the birds should have gone by the middle of August, really. And just little MP3 files of calls of birds talking to each other, not just necessarily the screaming calls, but some of them might be nest defense calls. So if the swifts are really reassured if there are other birds in a nesting area, and so having birds fighting over nest sites is almost a good thing, because if you put up other opportunities for them, then they're likely to use it. I should say that you don't have to do it this way. Actually, you can just use like a travel speaker with and play it. It's more reliable. It's just if you can do it automatically and not have to think about it. If you've got a travel speaker, you usually have to go and switch it on and all that sort of thing. So it's a bit more. It might take a bit longer, but you do need patience with swifts. They sometimes will just roost in a box before they start breeding, so they might just check it out for a year, especially young birds when they're finding their partner for the first time and their nest site. They might not breed straight away. More experienced birds, when they're finding a new space, might get going quicker, but do be patient with it. If you find a swift on the ground, that's usually a problem, and don't pick it up and throw it in the air to see if it'll fly. It might be injured, Generally speaking, if it's in May when you find one, it'll obviously be an adult bird returning, and it's probably got exhausted itself trying to get into a nest site that's been blocked off. They are very loyal to their nest sites, and so if they get blocked off, they'll try and try and try, and sometimes they even break a wing or damage feathers, and they just get so exhausted that they'll just fall to the ground and can easily get predated when they're like that. So sometimes it's just a rest that they need. So put it in a safe place, put it in a ventilated box to just keep it safe, and see if it'll fly after an hour. And what you do is you just put it on your hand like this and see if it'll go. This is a young bird, not an adult bird. And this is one that came out of the nest too soon and had to be fed a little bit longer and then released. But yeah, just at shoulder height, and it should go if it's fit to fly. It's in their genes. They want to fly. They want to fly. They don't want to stop. And so if it's going to go, it'll go. Sometimes they come out of the nest too soon for whatever reason. If they've lost a parent, or if a parent's been predated, they can get predated by things like a hobby or a sparrowhawk. Sometimes I've seen here. But not much really can catch a swift. It's usually when they're slowing down in and out of nest sites that they get caught. Or a hobby is quite agile. But this one on the left is probably 2-3 weeks old, and this one is a little bit probably about 4 weeks old. But you can see the eyes are sunken and very dull. They just look really miserable. This one's still got waxy pin on the feathers, and look, the tail's not long, the wings are not long, so that's got a bit longer to be in the nest. So as I said, when they leave the nest, they have to fly for 3 years non-stop. So they've got to be fit to fly, not like your average robin or your blackbird, which will get out of the nest as soon as possible because it's a risk of predation. If they can clamber around a bush and the parents can still find them, then that's what they do. But they're hopping and not really flying yet, are they? So swifts are a bit different. So they're in the nest for up to 6 weeks, depending how well they're getting fed. So you can see how bright the eyes are now. So this one's been rehydrated and then given plenty of crickets and waxworms, which are caterpillars of the wax moth larvae, and maybe even bee drone larvae, to feed them up. So it's very specialist food. You can't can't give them cat food like you would a hedgehog. They eat insects. They want insects. Don't give them anything else. It'll kill them. You can see their little claws here on their little pink feet, and real characters they are. And like I said about the white face, this is obviously going to start to darken up as it gets older. So how do they get flight fit? When they're in the nest site, they do all of these exercises to strengthen the muscles and get them right. You can see that it's doing a little bit of flapping if there's room. It's using the claws to hang on to the vertical surface. Some of them will do it on the floor, but basically doing press ups, and they'll bend their tail to the left and right, as well as doing this stretching out, sort of bending like a banana, pushing up with the wings. And they'll do this for hours on end to get ready. And they'll sit on this, what I call the exercise wall, watching any insects that are out the window. And then that gets them going. That starts them off wanting to exercise and think, oh yeah, I've got to do that. And so you feed them up, and then you start to they themselves start to reduce the amount of food that they eat before they get flight ready, because they end up getting too heavy otherwise and they won't go. So they put themselves on a little bit of a diet, which is like the parents just leaving them. And that's what they do, is they feed them up until they're ready. And then the parents know that they have to leave them, and then it's up to the birds to get exercise and go and start flying themselves. And so this is releasing this bird, and as I'm holding it and I'm just gently trying to encourage it to open its wings. It touches down briefly. I thought it wasn't going to go, and then the acceleration away off sort of in a southeasterly direction, which was great, and away it goes. And it's so exciting when that happens, because you just think it's actually really quite stressful looking after these birds in care. You don't take it on lightly. It's really, and I mean, I can only do the easy ones, and there are more experienced carers than I who do some amazing work. And yeah, so just get in touch with us and we'll tell you what to do, basically, and whether to bring it. It's better to bring it to us. So I really hope that you've been inspired to help your local swift colonies. Do get in touch. We really want to keep the summer skies full of screaming birds. So take a screen grab of this information, and hopefully, you know, if you're not in Norfolk, find your local Swift group for advice on any of this. And there's always guided walks in the summer, which are really exciting to see colonies in action. So yeah, thank you very much. Enjoy your summer.